Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast. This one's being recorded on August the 6th. I'm just back from a mini road trip, catching up with friends, catching a few fish, which has been fantastic fun. I'm really looking forward to recording this podcast, and then conditions down here in Devon are absolutely spot on. It's overcast, it's warm. I'm hearing lots of people catching fish on ants, trout on ant patterns as well. So I'm going to pick up my friend Perry, and then we're going to go hit the river and see if we can find some fish. But I'm really pleased today to be joined by Feargal Sharkey, who is extremely well known as being a musician, but he's also a passionate fly angler who cares deeply about the environment in which trout and grayling live. Abstraction and pollution are two of the topics we'll be covering, along with his career in fly fishing. Feargal, how's it going?
It's fantastically well, I have to say. I can't complain. A glorious thing. You get to spend an hour talking about fly fishing. What could go wrong?
Oh, I think we'll probably have to edit it, because if the talk off mic was anything to go by, I think we're going to be talking a long time.
As I normally caution people with these things, Pete, invariably I start talking, and if anybody is at the receiving end of it, they are at liberty to take the electronic scissors to it in whatever way they feel is most appropriate.
And I was thinking the first time I met you must have been more than 20 years ago now, and we were a member of the same fishing club, and I remember us chatting about an epic spinnerful. We'd both been fishing, I think, on the chalk stream somewhere or other, and we were chatting away. But that was a club I was a member of for a number of years and thoroughly enjoyed. And you've been a member many, many years, and that's the Amwell Magna Fishing Club. And I think it is one of the oldest established fishing clubs in the UK and perhaps beyond. Is that right?
It is, yes. The claim that we make is that we were the oldest club still fishing the same bit of river. Now, that is a clear distinction between us, the Houghton Club, and the Piscatorial Society, as the other two have held various bits of river and moved around the country over the years, where the Alma Magna, I think this is the 178th year, 179th year. So next year will be our 180th birthday. And for the last 179 years, the Alma Magna has been looking after the same 2.5 mile stretch of the River Lee in Hertfordshire.
Wonderful. And I know the fishing well, and I'm sure it's changed since I've last fished there. How would you describe that to our listeners?
It is a curious little thing in the Upper Lee these days. For those of you that aren't aware of this, the Upper Lee from Hertford, the last 26 miles down to London, for 500 years has been fought over, engineered, turned into a navigation, into a canal. It became quite a big commercial artery in and out of London. So the rest of the river looks like a canal. It's concrete sides, concrete bottom, and clearly was there to ensure the safe passage of goods and services in and out of London. By a quirk of fate, some 200 years ago, the 2.5 mile stretch that is the Alma Magna fishery got marooned and slightly left aside. And it's the reason why it is now the only last remaining stretch from Hertford downstream that actually still looks like a river, that still has a gravel riverbed, that still has normal bankside vegetation. We have one of the biggest watervole populations probably in the whole of Hertfordshire. It is now a preserve for incredible wildlife and is also home to the last sole remaining breeding population of wild brown trout in the River Lee downstream from Hertford.
Wow, and it really is a pretty stream, and the ash there as well that runs into the club waters there. Is that a chalk stream itself?
Yeah. Oh yes, no, it's hard to believe in the modern world, but the Upper Lee outside the M25 is still classified as a chalk stream. Now, it's quite clear that it's been subject to 500 years worth of abuse by man, if not longer than that. But it is actually still classified as a chalk stream. So I guess the easiest thing to say, I live in Finchley, North London. I can get in my car and 40 minutes later find myself standing in 2.5 miles of private river valley looking at the Alma Magna fishery. And I have to tell you, on a Friday night, after a particularly disturbing, troublesome, arduous week, it makes the heart sing.
That's one of the things, isn't it, about fishing and where it takes you away from everyday life. And sometimes it can be in the company of friends, but sometimes just being alone and that unwinding. And fish can be a happy coincidence, really, can't they? Just being there can often be enough. And knowing it pretty well, it's a really pretty little place to be. Like you say, heading out of London a short distance and then being in paradise, really.
I a couple of weeks back was having a brief conversation by text with our honorary president, Matthew Wright. Matthew was up there one evening by himself and completely besotted and loving the experience. And I simply added, just wait until they start up the church bell practice in the Norman church a mile away on the other side of the valley. That's the bit that'll really bring a tear to your eye. And it is, we are incredibly grateful for having this beautiful, beautiful little environment. I say this, Pete, with respect to my fellow members. Sometimes I explain it that the Alma Magna is consisted of predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly 60 awkward, cantankerous, bloody-minded, ugly, middle-aged old men far too used to getting their own way in life. But we have this absolute sanctuary that's been nurtured and protected for almost 180 years and has had anything to do with the fact that it's been looked after, protected by a bunch of awkward, cantankerous, bloody-minded, ugly, middle-aged old men. The two are clearly interlinked.
And do you think that's a reason why the model that you've put in for that club and caring about the fish and the environment, do you think because of that membership, that's how that's come about and how you've taken on water companies and everything else? Do you think that's part of it?
Oh, listen, without hesitation, the Alma Magna has a long, fine history of challenging decisions being made in the external world and things that would influence and impact upon the river. And as you can imagine, if you've been in existence for 180 years, it's not the first time that the river has been threatened in some way or other, and not necessarily the first time that the members of the Alma Magna have stood up to the plate and been prepared to defend that river against any kind of external pressure. I guess the most obvious one of all, you may remember in the middle of the valley, which historically was completely flat floodplain, open grassland, sheepcote farm, and was mined quite heavily in the 1970s and 80s for gravel. And the original plan, so far as I remember, was that the river itself was also going to be excavated. So the 2.5 miles of river would effectively have disappeared. Well, unfortunately, the planning authority hadn't reckoned on the members of the Alma Magna fishery. And one public inquiry later, and the planning inspector ruled that a 30-foot buffer had to be kept at all times between any gravel excavations and the river to preserve the river. So that's just the way we are. We normally, I guess I could summarize it this way, Ryan. We'd like to try and support our neighbours and interact with our neighbours and be collaborative and supportive and work in conjunction with our neighbours. And we have some fantastic neighbours. The Nicholas Buxton, who owns the local estate, the Hearts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust. But when it comes down to the wire, the Alma Magna fishery has a fine tradition of 180 years of defending that river, and we will continue to do that.
That's great, isn't it? And that ethos being passed down as well is because it could sometimes be lost as well, couldn't it? Or the fight could not be picked up in such a strong and passionate manner, I guess.
Sure, no, that's okay, but you have to decide what's important and significant in your life and what steps you're prepared to take. And clearly, I interpret it, as do the members of the Alma Magna, that we do have an obligation to the members of the Alma Magna fishery who follow on after us for the next 180 years to ensure that at some point well into the 21st century, people can still travel from the centre of London and 40 minutes later be standing in 2.5 miles of pristine river system right on the edge of London, watching a wild brown trout rise to a dry fly.
That's wonderful. That's really, really cool. One of my memories of it is when I had a proper job was sometimes walking through to fish some of the pools. And I remember particularly fishing the ash one Sunday and having the nettle stings and going to work the next day reminded of the day that I'd had previously by the nettle stings. And it was kind of cool, really.
We still, and I guess we'll come on to this later. We still manage the ash. If you would, I guess I would summarize it as benign neglect. Now, there's a reason for it. Historically, the river ash, in fact, there was one caught this year, gives up some quite colossal trout, and we are talking 5-6 pounds trout. Now, we do, like most rivers around London, suffer from quite a big infestation of signal crayfish. On the main river itself, we do trap them, and quite aggressively. But in the River Ash, we deliberately leave them alone. We don't make any particular attempt to mow or manage the bankside vegetation, so you will still have to wade your way through the nettles. It's incredibly challenging fishing, but on a monotonously regular basis, 5-6 pound trout get caught in that river, and I've absolutely no doubt they in themselves are providing the best deterrent we have against crayfish, because we certainly do not put fish in that river anywhere near that kind of size. So if you want to challenge, if you want to get stung by nettles, if you want to hide behind a thistle while you try and lob a dry fly blindly over a gooseberry bush into a chalk stream, yeah, it's there for you. It's there to be had on the River Ash.
I'm thinking while you're describing it, actually, it probably set consciously or subconsciously the life I lead now and the fishing that I enjoy as probably as a result of that, to be honest.
Well, we do apologise.
One day I'll grow up and do something grown up, but but that'll do for me. So tell me, Feargal, how did fishing come into your life?
It goes back to, like an awful lot of things, a victim of circumstance. I went to a school called the Christian Brothers School, and invariably one of these things. Now, bear in mind, this was Derry, Northern Ireland, in the late 1960s. The civil rights movement was at its peak. It was a time of some turmoil, socially, economically, historically, and the school I went to, the Christian Brothers were incredibly renowned for this idea that you were going to have an education, and a very broad, rounded education, whether you liked the idea or not. And they could offer up, shall I say this possibly as delicately as I can, they occasionally would offer up means of stimulating you to do that might not necessarily be approved of in modern classrooms. But part of it, to their credit, was the normal things like debating clubs and everything else. But they also made a huge attempt to introduce everybody to fly fishing. Now, bear in mind, this is Derry. The River Foyle system itself, particularly in the upper reaches on the Finn and the Mourne, is still some of the best salmon fishing in Western Europe. Literally 5 miles outside Derry is the River Faughan, which at the time was one of the best salmon rivers in Western Europe. And I could literally take the bus from the centre of town out to the Faughan. And there's a very old song, funny enough, the lyric of which is, "It's just 3 miles from Derry to the bridge of Drumahoe." Well, I can tell you that I caught my first brown trout on a dry fly at the bridge at Drumahoe, 3 miles outside the centre of Derry. Then you look west and you go into Donegal, and there's just any number of sea trout, salmon, lakes full of brown trout that nobody ever goes fishing for. Simply because, what do you want to do that for? There's a river over there with a really good gristle run and full of sea trout at this time of year. So it was all there. They put enormous effort into it. And indeed, I was I guess to summarize it, I was taught to tie my first fly, which was a bloody butcher, by my English teacher in school.
And how did you sort of have the way I picture it is that were you sort of standing out in the field with fly rods and being shown how to cast or
Yep, yeah, yeah. Oh no, it was all of that and taken away it, and school bought a minibus and all that kind of stuff. And yes, some of it would be the hurling team would be taken off to play hurling matches or Gaelic football matches, and other weekends we'd all be packed off into Donegal to go salmon fishing or sea trout fishing in some river in Donegal.
so that was, it's a really interesting and different path, isn't it? Because many people, it may be a family member, it may be entering fishing via course fishing, and coming into it there straight away. You were in there at, I guess, the age 10, 12, 13 that you were out there and fishing.
That's exactly it. In fact, it's one of my normal standard responses that if people are kind enough to comment about my casting or presentation and stuff, and my ability to occasionally catch the odd trout or salmon, and my normal response is, well, I have been doing this for 50 years, so you would hope that somewhere along the way I had learned bloody well something.
Yeah. And do you get back to fish those rivers again? How are they comparable to your youth?
Not as much as I should, and an awful lot of those rivers are now under, like all of the rivers in England, under enormous pressure. The River Faughan right now is just a shadow of its former self. And in fact, to be somewhat provocative, the Northern Ireland Environment Agency should be hanging their heads in shame. There's a major roadworks being built on the A6 right now over the River Faughan that for the last couple of years, people can look it up on Twitter. The little River Faughan Angling Association, constantly posting footage of these enormous silt runoff coming from the roadworks and polluting the Reds on what should be one of the finest salmon rivers in the whole of bloody Western Europe. So they're angry right now, they're motivated, they're frustrated, and I think personally, I think we're going to have to, society, spend quite a lot of time very quickly just reflecting on what future we would actually truly like for our rivers and the ecology and the environment that we have around us.
And does the local economy rely on salmon anglers coming to fish those? Is that a large part of it as well, or a part of it?
Listen, of course it is, and particularly when you get into Donegal, in fact, it faces an awful lot of the same challenges as the west of Scotland. And how do you balance the income derived from the tourism and the influx of fishermen and salmon fishermen in particular? And how do you balance that by salmon farms and the impact they have on sea cages in the estuaries of rivers that once had hugely productive runs of salmon and sea trout? And they're certainly not what they once were.
I think I got an email the other day about salmon runs are 75% down from 50 years ago.
That wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me at all. And we can all extol the virtues of why that may or may not be, and there's that argument's been well rehearsed for far too long now. For me, ultimately, what is missing from this, and I will probably castigate everybody slightly, but for me, the whole conversation is missing leadership. Both leadership in terms of the environment lobby and certainly political leadership that is prepared to take that broader oversight and make some very, very difficult decisions. There's too many cans being kicked down too many roads for far too long.
Yeah, it strikes me, and if anyone's listened to these, that I talk about sewage treatment works a fair bit, and it seems to me that there are silos of people fighting or trying to publicize what's going on, yet it's not like you say, even those silos could be joined up. And I know, in social media and the work that you've done to highlight the misuse of the water sources. Do you think that's where you're heading with that as well? That we need somebody to join those silos up and get everyone singing together?
Well, listen, there is, but it is a big, complicated situation. It's one that not necessarily I approve of. I think that there has been. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday that's chairman of a small kind of NGO and has 20, 30 years experience in this. And I did pose him a slightly rhetorical question. And what I asked him was, I understand the idea of collaboration and I understand the idea of working in partnership with other people. And whether that's the local water company or the Environment Agency and other NGOs and everybody else. But here we are 30 years after the water industry was privatized. And I'm not making an argument for or against privatization, but it's a nice marker in the sand. 30 years later, these rivers are in a worse condition than they've ever been. So what has this collaboration delivered? And at what point does that collaboration actually turn into providing a foundation and support and upholding a failed system? And at what point do you start doing something different? Because it is, I'm not the first to say it, it is that classic definition of madness that you keep repeating the same strategy in the desperate hope that you deliver some different output at some point in the future. Well, it doesn't work like that. So here's my challenge to everyone involved, and myself included. We've been doing it for 30 years. It clearly hasn't worked. What now?
Here's one of the things, and I may have mentioned it, I can't remember in one of the podcasts. Do you think, as a community, that we should be, we're vocal, obviously, and yourself particularly with the posts that you make, and somebody like yourself, people are listening to as well. But do you think, let's talk about a water company, for example, do you think we should be attending outside in a peaceful way the AGMs and letting a wider range of people be aware of what's happening with water companies? And, if there is a group of people gathering there that gets the appropriate, perhaps, press coverage, should we be considering things like that are a little bit more radical, perhaps?
Well, the press coverage over the last year and a half or so has been going actually quite well, if I don't say so. There was a piece in the FT yesterday about the Public Accounts Committee has now written to the Permanent Secretary of DEFRA. And the focus of that letter is one of the big things that's clearly going on in the background and created the situation we're in. And by the way, I include both sewage and the dumping of sewage into our rivers and the over abstraction of our chalk streams in the same category. What ultimately is driving all of that is a political decision about the price of water. And you couple that with a failed regulatory system, and you now have the current situation we're in. For example, when it comes to give your listeners a bit of a flavour of this, for reasons that in the reasonable future will become apparent. But I was spending some time looking at the Hampshire Avon catchment system the other day. Now, as you may or may not know, the Avon is categorised as a special area of conservation. And that includes not only the main river, but its major tributaries, the Nadder, the Wylie, the Bourne, etc., etc. So far as we can figure out, into a catchment comprised of chalk streams, some of the rarest habitats on the planet, that are afforded the highest level of not only national but pan-European legal protection we have to offer as SACs, specifically protected under the Habitats Directive. And yet last year, sewage companies spent over 14,600 hours dumping sewage into those rivers. That is the equivalent of 606 days worth of dumping sewage into some of the rarest river habitats on the planet, and that are afforded the highest form of legal protection this country has to offer.
And do you think one of the main points of this is that they can do that as an operating cost because the fines aren't big enough? Is that the thing that could turn this around?
Well, listen, the technical background into it, and I'm going to get slightly technical. So again, if everybody will forgive me, all of that thing in terms of getting rid of sewage and wastewater, excess wastewater, is covered by the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. The UK was actually taken to the European Court of Justice in 2012 by the European Commission, and the Court of Justice ruled that the UK was in breach of that directive by the random frequent nature that we allow water companies to dump sewage into rivers. And the court ruled that that should only ever possibly happen in exceptional circumstances. Now, my interpretation, that is the classic act of God, get out of jail card, that you can't rule out every 100% of all circumstances all of the time, but you should only be doing that in exceptional circumstances. Like earlier this year, when Gloucestershire and Wiltshire was hit by those two massive storms coming in off the Atlantic. Clearly, you can't plan a system to deal with that. But can someone please explain to me what is remotely exceptional about 14,642 hours in 1 year? At what point does the regulator step in and start doing their job?
Yeah. So do we have to, how do we make things aware continually? Do we continually hit the regulators? Do we, what is it that we can do?
Well, listen, personally speaking, I think that from my own interpretation of it, I think at this point in time, there is no option left but to take government to the High Court. People have written letters, people have talked to their MPs, people have had meetings with local, regional, national environment agency, with government, with DEFRA, and all of it has come to naught. And it's back to that rhetorical question, why keep repeating the same strategy over and over again in the hope that it will deliver a different outcome? It doesn't.
And one of the problems must be that I get the impression, I think it's the case, that the water companies are funding a lot of like-minded people who are in that area, the wildlife trust or whatever it is. They have fingers in pies as well, which they're funding them. So it makes it difficult for some of these people to stand up and fight against them, doesn't it?
I can think of one organisation, and I'm not going to name who it is, but it is an NGO that receives over 60% of its funding from the Environment Agency and the local water company. Now, how much are you prepared to challenge what provides your core funding? And by the way, I totally understand and am sympathetic to the situation that organisation finds itself in. But again, you have to ask, what we've been doing for 30 years has failed. Now, what are we going to do differently? Even if that means finding other sources of funding to recreate your independence. I've had a couple of very long conversations with Hugo from Surfers Against Sewage. Fantastic organisation, done a brilliant job in trying to, again, identify, get something changed, ensure that beaches are clean and people can go swimming off our coast and surfing without swimming into the detritus and rubbish from the average sewage system. And Hugo is adamant and very determined. They have never taken a penny from a water company, nor will they ever.
Yeah. Do you think the general public are aware? Because we get these, and as you well know, we had the case down here on the River Mole, which I think you were on our local TV about it, weren't you?
I happened to be actually holidaying in that part of the world when it happened. And I was spotted by a local journalist who's turned out actually was working in that story and asked me if I would do a quick spot on the telly on it. And I was very happy to, because it's the regulatory system's failing.
Yeah. And do you think, though, that once these things are out in the public, it's sort of kind of forgotten about a little bit? And we've just had that one, excuse my pronunciation, of the Llyn Fee River. You know, there's been a huge pollution incident there. Do you think these things need to be continually pushed to the general public as well, to let them be aware of what's happening? Because for them, possibly it's something in their news feed or they see on the news and then kind of forget about a bit. Do you think it does take us to continually push those?
I would listen. They do. People, Yeah, people have busy lives, and particularly at the moment in history that we're now in, people have got a lot to be thinking about, like jobs, feeding their children, paying their mortgages, and trying to reassemble their lives. So I can understand how, for a lot of people right now, hearing about a fish kill on 5 miles of river in Wales might not necessarily be their biggest priority this week. But the simple fact of the matter is that is why Parliament passes legislation, creates things like the Environment Act, empowers organisation and funds organisations like the Environment Agency to act on behalf of the population. And that's the people that get appointed to those boards, the non-exec directors at organisations like Natural Resources Wales or the Environment Agency are there specifically to act on behalf of the public and to take care of that kind of thing on behalf of the public in trust for them. So personally, I go straight to the boards of those organisations, because if you want to remind people and suggest that some people need to spend more time thinking about the fact that not a month ago, the River Wye in Wales had a 5 mile algae bloom on it in one of the most precious salmon rivers in the whole of the whole of United Kingdom. They need to start to think what they're doing and their role and their function in this, and whether or not their organisations, which they run and control, are doing their jobs properly, because clearly they're not.
And do the companies engage with you? The water companies and the EA, are they engaging with you?
The water companies do. I've kind of speak to them on a regular basis. The simple truth of the matter is, and I'm going to keep possibly coming back to this reoccurring theme, we now know, and is becoming more and more apparent, that the water industry has suffered from an enormous lack of underinvestment over the last 30 years. That's why the sewage system is in the state that it's in, and having to dump sewage into rivers. I think last year the total was, some of your listeners may want to go and look it up. The Guardian ran an article about a month ago, where they issued freedom of information requests to all of the sewage companies. And as it transpires, last year, from the data sets we've got, water companies on over 200,000 separate occasions spent over 1.5 million hours dumping sewage into rivers in England. Now, can somebody please tell me what's exceptional about all of that? As we now know, FT ran an article 2 weeks ago. Southern Water has now pleaded guilty to having spent 5 years dumping sewage into Whipsnade Bay, Heron Bay, Sittingbourne, the River Bewley, and on and on and on. 5 years. Question becomes, what the hell was the Environment Agency doing for 5 years when all of this was going on? And I know that we have a specialist listenership here, but to remind your listeners, the River Bewley still has a run of sea trout and a run of salmon. And there's the local sewage company merrily spending 5 years dumping sewage into it. It's not an accusation. They've just pleaded guilty in court.
And what do you think will happen as a result of that? It will be a hand slap, small fine that's in the operating costs of the company. Will that be the extent of it, and they carry on as normal again?
Well, clearly that has been the tradition in the past. And I say this as a former regulator, as it happens. Historically, there was a viewpoint that the mere fact that you had sanctioned a regulated company was in itself enough. The size and scale and extent of that sanction possibly took second place. Now, to give you an example of that, as we know historically, there is a position, which may or may not be true, that some companies simply see the fines and levies imposed as a cost of doing business, because it's cheaper to pay the fine than actually invest and go and fix the system in itself. I have personally spoken to a number of regulators involved in the water industry. If you are going to intervene like that, The best way to approach it, in my personal opinion, is to reach an agreement with the industry. Here are the rules. And in the modern world, the rules that we have consulted on, we have discussed, we have mutually agreed to a large extent. Now, here's the thing, as your regulator, do not break the rules. If you keep to that simple edict, you will never ever have to speak to your regulator ever again. You break those rules, you will discover the regulator carries a very big stick. And there's clearly nowhere near enough stick, and clearly nowhere near enough strident opposition and proactive management of the industry from either DEFRA, the EA, or Ofwat. And it is that failure on all three organisations that, in terms of England and Wales, has created the situation we're in.
And one of the problems seem to be that, as we continue, and even where I am down here in Devon, there's houses being built the whole time, that the infrastructure is being put on more and more pressure, isn't it? Where more houses on ancient sewage treatment works, that it just continues, doesn't it?
Curious thing is, the supply of water and sewage is not actually a planning issue. So your local council or your local planning authority, it's not actually something they can take into consideration. It is simply up to this 5-year cycle we have, where in Devon it's what, Wessex Water, is it?
Southwest Water.
Okay, Southwest Water, every 5 years will sit down and put a business plan together, put some forecasts and projections together of what they see the population increase is going to be between 2025 and 2030, and then outline where they're going to get the water to meet the demand that they have forecast, and they then make an argument with Ofwat. As the regulator, that's not part of a conversation with the local authority at all. And that in itself causes one of the flaws. Because you are right, nobody at a local level is sitting asking those two very simple questions. Where is the water coming from? And what are you going to do with all the waste? Well, as we now know, if last year is anything to go by, we spend over 1.5 million hours dumping that waste into the nearest river.
Absolutely. And the Environment Agency, you mentioned them a few times, and it seems to me, and I've a good friend working there who's doing everything he possibly can, I know, but it seems to me that they're cutting back on staff, they're cutting back on everything, and so I can't kind of figure out where their focus is anymore.
I don't think they have one. And I would want to be very, very clear about this. Without exception, every time I run into someone from the Environment Agency wearing a dry suit, standing in the middle of a river, without exception, they're just incredibly decent, dedicated, committed people trying really hard to do the right thing. There has been changes in the funding structure within the EA. There has been changes in staff numbers, but I do need to put this on record. If you actually go and look at the annual returns for the Environment Agency, they spent more money last year than they did 10 years ago, and they still employ over 10,000 people. For me, there is some major fault lines and significant failures within both the board and the senior management of the Environment Agency. And it's an old cliche, but I think it's worth repeating here. I think we are actually dealing with an organisation that is lions being led by donkeys.
So are you talking to those people at board level? Are you able to get access to them?
I'm not sure they would take my phone call right now. I have had some conversations with them. I have not necessarily found them as productive. I, again, think it's back to that issue of the lack of leadership and this vacuum that exists. A very simple illustration in this, by the way, is the now perilous state of water supply in London and the southeast of England. In very round numbers, London and the southeast of England, 25 million people are now running out of water. How in God's name do we get into this situation? This is a G7 member state. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the planet. And yet 25 million people are now on the verge of running out of water. We're now on a list with cities like Cape Town, Jakarta, Sao Paulo in Brazil. Who was in charge? Well, there's the issue, because as it turns out, nobody was in charge. And I have to point the finger at DEFRA and the EA and Ofwat. And Ofwat in particular, as the headline in the FT said yesterday morning, Ofwat in particular seems utterly obsessed by artificially suppressing the price of water. Well, as it turns out, we now are running out of water, and we're now going to have to start investing colossal sums of money in trying to build the infrastructure nationally to supply and import water from other parts of the United Kingdom into the south and southeast.
And that's just ridiculous, isn't it? Like you say, in the 21st century, it's ridiculous.
It's an extraordinary idea. And by the way, people in Hertfordshire still are among the heaviest users of water anywhere in Europe. I think it's on average something like 174 litres of water per person per day.
And does that mean abstraction's going to take place on our already understrained rivers?
Well, as I've said to a number of people, it's too late in terms of the Chilterns and Hertfordshire and the Cam and East Anglia. It's too late. These rivers have no more to give. You've taken it all. And that's now forced the hand, that people are now beginning to look at massive, massive national infrastructure projects. There's a National Audit Office did a report into this about a year ago, and is one of the most damning reports that I have ever read. And indeed, the Public Accounts Committee, Select Committee, did an inquiry into this 3 months ago. And again, is one of the most damning things you've ever read. And it's pointing the finger clearly at those in charge of that trilogy of DEFRA, Ofwat, and the EA. Nobody's been in charge. There's no leaders involved in any of it. There's no one taking control. And in the meanwhile, water companies are trying to spend as little as money and invest as little money as they can and offshore as much of it to the benefit of their shareholders, tax-free as they can possibly get away with. And nobody's been in charge.
No. And putting that into context for those chalk streams north of London, I know you put a picture out recently of, I apologize if it wasn't the Chess, but it was one of the rivers where I think you said along the lines of there should be ranunculus here, but instead there's stinging nettles because there is no water in that river.
Correct. I actually went up there yesterday. And that picture that was flagged up to me by a couple of guys that live locally. That's the River Culm up between Radlett and London Cluny. It's a chalk stream. And that particular picture is under the viaduct, which carries one of the main railway lines out of London, heading up north. And that river's completely gone. It is just a dusty bottom. And that one particular water company that services that area of Hertfordshire, the Chilterns and parts of North London is Affinity Water. And I'm personally fascinated by the idea that Affinity Water has about 10% of the world's total supply of chalk streams within their service area, every one of which is, and I use this word passionately, completely knackered.
Yeah, like you say, there's a number of streams there, aren't there, that we don't know about, that have quietly been going about their business and have just been hoovered and sucked dry.
Oh, sure. And Paul Jennings will extol at great length because of the heavy rain earlier this year. We did get a momentary lift as there was something resembling an aquifer recharge earlier this year. And for the first time in about 10 years, the River Chess has been flowing through Chesham. Paul then discovers that back, I think it was in April and May, maybe March, April, that for 50 days, Thames Water were dumping sewage into the river. So as you can imagine, Paul has campaigned on this brilliantly for probably 20 years. And finally, he manages to get some flow back in a chalk stream. And then you discover that for 50 consecutive days, the local water company were quietly dumping sewage into a chalk stream.
You could imagine them sitting there saying, great, we've got the aquifers filled up a little bit, we can get rid of some.
There you go. Welcome to the modern environmental concerns of the DEFRA, the Environment Agency, water companies, and Ofwat.
Wow, that is absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely. I can't. I'm almost going to swear. Actually, I'm really. It's, um,
Don't worry, I do frequently.
yeah. How do you know where that tipping point came for you when you said, "I've had enough. I need to do some stuff about this"?
It was the background to this is fairly straightforward. When we were chatting about the Alma Magna fishery and the members being only too prepared to defend it, the club began raising concerns with the Environment Agency about disappearing flows on the river back in the late 1990s. I think it's about 1997. That then launched this incredibly lengthy, detailed investigation involving Thames Water, which is a local abstraction point, any number of big global environment consultancy companies writing very wordy, lengthy, turgid reports into what may or may not be happening with the aquifer underneath the river valley and flow readings and mean tropic rant scoring and endless fish surveys and on and on and on and on and on. When I began to get involved in the committee some 12 or 13 years later, after the original complaint, I kind of clearly sat there and thought, this has been going on for almost 15 years. What the hell's going on? So I then started to scratch, and I got an itch. And I got such an itch that I contacted Fish Legal. And with Fish Legal, the Alma Magna fishery, we spent about a year and a half preparing a case for the High Court to take the Environment Agency to judicial review. Now, we got within half an hour of actually issuing the papers against the Environment Agency, when thankfully, I have to say, the grown-ups got in the room and we were able to resolve our differences quite quickly. And I'm pleased to say there is more water flowing down the Alma Magna fishery right now than we have seen in 20 years. And that river is looking absolutely magnificent. So for the grown-ups at the Environment Agency who helped facilitate all of that, my applause, my thanks, and my recognition. But the experience gave me an itch that if a fishing club working with a little charity called Fish Legal had to go to all of that kind of trouble and those kind of lengths, what else might be going on? And that gave me an itch. And rather bloody stupidly, I scratched that itch. And as you can now imagine, every time I scratch that itch, I just end up with a bigger itch. And I'm still scratching 2 years later. And you then uncover the absolutely perilous state that the chalk streams around London are in. They've been hit by this double whammy, and I know your listeners will be sensitive to this. The things that make chalk streams unique is the quality of the water. Guess how seductive that quality of water is to a water company? I can suck it out of the ground, suck it out of a river. I don't have to spend very much money, if at all, any at all, treating it before I can shove it down a pipe and sell it to my customers. Brilliant. And in the terms of the chalk streams around London, water's big, heavy, expensive stuff. And it's big and heavy and expensive to move around because you need big, heavy motors and pumps to get it from one end of the country to the other. And of course, the London chalk streams were in prime position. They're right on the edge of the largest conurbation and biggest population centre in the United Kingdom. So we don't have to move that water very far. And indeed, the earliest reference we can find is from a man called R.S. Walters, who was a hydrologist and engineer back in the early 1960s and wrote a report in 1963 where he said the chalk aquifer around London has been pumped almost to extinction. That was 60 years ago. We're still pumping it. We've now completely drained it dry. And that's why where former vibrant, successful ecosystems are now nothing more than dried up ditches. I can give you a very simple example. Wickenham Mill on the River Bean in Hertfordshire, we've recently uncovered some of the mill records which indicate 3-4 pound wild brown trout being caught in the mill pool back in the late 1800s. That river does not exist for 10 miles anymore. It is simply a grassy ditch running through the Hertfordshire countryside.
It's frightening, isn't it? Frightening. And so, what can we do? You're vocal on social media. What can anglers do? Because I hope they listen to this and say, right, I want to scratch this itch a little bit more. I want to be a little bit more vocal. I want to do stuff. What can anglers do using, because social media is a pretty powerful tool now?
Listen, absolutely. The easiest thing you can do is start by contacting your local representatives, both at a local council level, but more importantly and significantly, your local MP, and make sure they understand. And there's been a number of very successful instances of that that's going on. The mere fact that we now have select committees meeting in Parliament and chalk streams become the focus and the centre point of those discussions, that in itself has come a long way, because that simply wouldn't have happened 2 or 3 years ago. That we know the pressure is slowly building, but I think it's going to need ultimately those two things to apply. That ministers, in particular DEFRA and Number 10, get the idea that people in this country do care about the environment. We do care and treasure these unique global river systems we have, and we're not simply prepared to tolerate a situation where water companies spend over 1.5 million hours a year dumping sewage into our bloody rivers. And to coordinate that, personally, I'm completely convinced of it at this point. I'd be delighted for government and DEFRA to tell me I'm wrong, but I think I will have to spend some time. I will not be surprised if at some point in the very near future I find myself standing on the opposite side of a courtroom from DEFRA.
And do you think, given the background that we've had with lockdown, with people saying, is the city for me, wherever those cities may be, not just London, that they're moving out to the country, they're exploring the great outdoors of the UK? Do you think there will be a way to engage those people that possibly may not have been aware of these things previously?
It's already going on. And when you get to people, as you can imagine, their response is horrific. Because again, we trust the system. There's a thing there called the Environment Agency. We trust that it actually has a legal obligation to nurture, protect, maintain, promote, and develop fisheries. Well, how are you doing that when you've allowed one of the rarest ecosystems on the planet, a chalk stream, to no longer exist because you've allowed a water company to take all the water from it? Yeah, things are changing and people are responding to it. And an easy example I can give you, if you look at the Clean Ilkley campaign right now, they've back in October last year applied for bathing water status for the river wharf through the middle of Ilkley. There is not a single river in England that actually is officially certified as bathing water status. Here we are, they filed the application in October, and here we are now almost 9 months later, and DEFRA is still not processing the application. What does that tell you? One of the clues, I'm saying this from memory, so if I haven't got the figures quite accurate, forgive me, so it'll be illustrative. From what I remember, last bank holiday August, the people of the Clean Ilkley campaign counted almost 700 local people on the river, picnicking on the banks, paddling in the river, swimming in the river, playing in the river. It is basically the Lido for the good people of Ilkley. Around the same period, they took some E. coli readings in that river. It was 4,200 times above the threshold for clean bathing water. I.e., you would not want to be anywhere near that river unless you're wearing a biological hazard suit.
Yeah. Dear me, that's frightening, isn't it?
Now, as you can imagine, when you explain to people who trust the system, who think the system's out there taking care of this stuff, and you explain that to people, you can imagine the shock and horror on their face. Again, Paul Jennings had that very example 2 weeks ago. Was notified by Thames Water that, again, following a rainstorm over London, they were once again dumping sewage into the Chess. And the very next day, Paul found a family swimming in a chalk stream and had to say to them, listen, I'm really sorry to explain to you, but you might want to get out of that river. I know superficially it looks pristine. It's a chalk stream. It should. But by the way, there was raw sewage been dumped into it not 24 hours ago. And the regulator does what?
Or just waits for more rain to do some more.
Well, there's the thing. So for me, you're invariably with these choices in life, you've got two paths to travel. We can all sit in the pub and cry into a pint of beer on how bad and how desperate it all is on a Friday night and clearly be totally ineffectual and achieve nothing. Or you can get angry and upset and motivated about it and go and change the bloody world. Well, guess which choice I've made?
Yeah, and thank you for that as well, from not just from me, but I'm sure from our listeners as well. And I hope this will encourage people to pick up the baton as well, or help with this in some way. And I think I'm gonna. I've tried to do as much as I can about the sewage treatment works, and I've talked to people about it and trying to engage people with it, and that we need to do something. And this is the perfect platform for people to say, look, this is enough now. We need to do more about it. So I hope our listeners are inspired by Feargal's words, because, it's not going to be around forever, and they're just going to continue doing this until we get them to stop.
Well, listen, the water companies, yeah, their imperative is to make as much money as they can as quickly as possible for their shareholders. That's what they exist to do. And they're very good. Some of them I've spoken to, I have a phenomenal admiration for, because they are absolutely brilliant with the bullshit and how they care about the chalk streams and how they're going to do this and do that and do the other thing. And yet here we are 30 years later, those rivers are in a more desperate state than they've ever been in the past. As some of your listeners may or may not know, we're currently in a situation where just 14% of rivers in England reach good ecological status. That, by the way, is based on data from 2016. DEFRA were supposed to provide an update at the end of last year. They didn't publish it. They kicked it into the long grass until late spring, early summer. That then became July, and they notified everyone 2-3 weeks ago that now maybe possibly will come out at some point, maybe in the autumn later in this year. What are they trying to hide?
Yeah, they know, they've seen it, I guess, and they know it's not going to be an improvement, is it?
In the background, that was all driven by the Water Framework Directive, which decreed that every river in England should originally have reached good ecological status by 2015. We then extended that deadline to 2017, 21, and then 27. If you look at government's language, I put a whole thread together on it. Michael Gove last year made a speech where he has now swerved the whole of that goal of getting our rivers, 100% of them, to good ecological status. If you want to have a look at government's 25-year plan for the environment, you will find it highlighted on page 26. The current objective, 75% of rivers in natural condition as soon as is practicable. Nobody can explain to me what natural condition actually means. And we all know how to interpret as soon as is practicable. And there is a can that's not only been kicked down the road, it's been kicked down a road 4 counties over. And by the way, the Environment Agency does what? The environment NGOs do what? And to highlight the idea, 2 days ago, the chief executive of the Environment Agency stands making a speech to the Chamber of Commerce in London, where he talks about the difficulties in delivering the objectives of the Water Framework Directive, and clearly trying to set a stage where they are going to now try and sidestep completely the objectives of the Water Framework Directive. And that's the chief executive of the Environment Agency. And I can assure you he would never have made that speech without the support of his board and the support of DEFRA.
Wow. Yeah. I was thinking about that 25-year plan, because that's a nice, easy one just to keep backtrailing and backtracking on as well, isn't it?
Well, it's a meaningless phrase anyway. 75% of water bodies in natural condition, nobody knows what that is, as soon as is practicable. Well, that could mean anything from in the next 15 seconds to a millisecond before the implosion of time itself and the end of the universe. At what point does it become practicable? Well, who knows?
And I guess this must be taking up a hell of a lot of your time as well, isn't it?
I think some people probably are probably somewhat aggrieved that I retired a few years ago. If I was still working in the music industry and working 100 hours a week, I might not be doing any of this. Listen, I clearly made a decision. What's going on out there is wrong. It's actually shameful. It is a complete and utter train wreck in terms of government policy, environment policy, and regulation. And I intend to shout about it as long and as hard as I can. Will I still have breath in me? And whilst anybody's prepared to listen, because what's happening is morally bankrupt and totally not justifiable. And those involved in it should hang their heads in shame.
Yeah. And I guess, the model that you've had with the Amwell fishery and the flows that you're having, it does work, doesn't it?
Well, listen, again, I would have to raise my hand, and there is a team of people locally that facilitated the state the Amwell Magna is now in. The end result, as I've highlighted, we've now got an incredible little head of the wild trout population coming back and being revived. We've seen more young coarsefish this year than it ever. We have the videos of the lamprey. We had a water vole survey done with the local Hertfordshire Wildlife Trust on an annual basis now, and the waterfall. Yeah, it's simple stuff. We knew all along that one of the bits of habitat we lacked was that classic low overhanging vegetation, much beloved of young trout fry. Gives them that shelter, gets them away from the big predators, and guess what? Waterfalls also love lots of that clean, shallow water with lots of luscious overhanging vegetation. And as much as it benefited our trout fry, it also seems they benefited the local wildlife, the local waterfall population. So for me, did the ends justify the means? Yeah. And I'm incredibly grateful to the team at Fish Legal, who were phenomenally supportive and gave me loads of advice, and to the club. And it actually all did come together. And we now have a fantastic looking river. The mayfly hatch this year was just off the scale. I've not seen anything like it. And the members voluntarily on our own internal WhatsApp group, just coming back from the river after an evening on the river, just going, Feargal, I turned up at 4 o'clock waiting for the sage to start popping up, and lo and behold, right on cue, 5:30, 6 o'clock, bingo, there's thousands of sage all the way up and down the river, and the trout going completely mad. This year, we've had any number of trout this year caught on damsel, and the trout just after the mayfly finished. And we're not, we can all speculate why these things happen. But my own personal favourite, the trout clearly had become accustomed, as they do, to leaping out of the water, grabbing mayfly on the wing. And as soon as the mayfly finished, the dragonflies started hatching and mating and laying eggs and stuff, and particularly at the Amwell Magna, the damsel, and the trout locked onto them and simply carried on that big splashy rise, trout leaping out of the water, trying to grab damsel dragonflies in flight. And the number of members that suddenly ordered up damsel dry flies and have been doing fantastically well from them over the last month and a half. Now, when was the last time you ever tied a replica of a damsel dragonfly onto the end of your fly line?
I do not think I ever have. And it's interesting because our fish at home, once they've had the mayfly, it goes quiet for a bit. It's almost as if they've eaten so many.
Traditional chalk stream scenario. So I'm just assuming they just got accustomed to watching what was above the surface and 5 or 6 inches above the surface during the mayfly, and realised that, this doesn't quite look the same as the thing was there a week ago, but it looks big and juicy and full of protein. I'm going to have it.
Yeah, that's amazing. No wonder you're getting those huge, great trout up there. Fantastic. And I get the impression that you loving fishing as much as you always have.
I have always done it. I've for trout fishing, particularly when I was working at my most manic, I guess, in the music industry. I've always had one of those brains that runs at 1,000 miles an hour and trying to process 100 different ideas and thoughts. And fly fishing has always been one of the few means of sanctuary that I've been able to develop as an adult, where I just focus on it so much and so intently that it allows me to push all the other daily grind and rubbish somewhere into the back of my mind. And perverse as it may sound, but focusing on that tiny, tiny little size 18 parachute atoms that I'm trying to flick in under that bloody canopy that's 2 inches off the river to get to that 3 pound wild brownie that's been sitting there all afternoon, supping up God knows what. I find that relaxing. It's perverse, I know, but it's just the way my DNA is built.
And did you, when you were in the industry with the band or latterly, would you, if you were touring or if you were away on business, would you seek out fishing somewhere?
An easy example I can give you was there was one occasion I was invited to speak at a conference in Washington, D.C. And it was a international copyright conference. Now, as you can appreciate, copyright is the heartbeat of the music industry and something we're quite interested in and quite important to us. However, the other way to look at it was here was a room full of 2,000 copyright lawyers descending from all over the world to sit in a Ronald Reagan Conference Center in Washington, D.C. And why in God's name, under any sort of circumstances, would I ever want to stand on a stage for an hour talking to that lot? And then I remembered I can fly in on the Friday night, hire a car, drive up to Pennsylvania, spend the weekend fishing the Letort and the Big Springs, and by Monday morning be back in Washington and on stage by lunchtime making my speech. Shall we just say I very happily accepted their incredibly generous invitation and spent a fantastic weekend up on the Letort and the limestone rivers up in Pennsylvania and Big Springs, Yellow Springs and Big Breaches and all of them. I had a fantastic weekend. So absolutely, I've accepted all kinds of invitations, was well renowned that if I was going to a particular bit of the world, invariably when the major rod manufacturers started mass basis introducing 4-piece rods, that became an absolute godsend in my life because I could just get them into the suitcase without having to worry about some completely dysfunctional baggage handler getting their hands on my CC de France or my Normark insignia or some rod that I was incredibly enthusiastic and passionate about that would, after a 16-hour trip, would come out as a small pile of crumpled carbon fiber.
And is there one of those places that you went to where you thought, this is it, I found it? Is there one destination that actually you thought, wow, or you just take it and enjoy it all for what it is?
Ironically enough, I don't at all. And it's one of the reasons that I've become so passionate about the chalk streams. That's it right there. You stand on an English chalk stream in prime health with that unbelievably glass-like crystal clear water that's got a clean, shiny bed of gravel populated with ranunculus and starwort. You will not find that anywhere else on the planet. So we actually have what are the best fly fishing rivers in the world right on our doorstep, and yet we're abusing the hell out of them.
It's interesting. My next question was going to be, is there a dream destination? But I suspect your dream destination is a chalk stream that's not been messed up by a water company.
There you go. That'll do.
Yeah.
For me, ironically enough, when you talk about the end of the mayfly and this idea that trout get completely full on the damn things and that they're just too pregnant with thousands of mayfly that they've consumed to actually care about moving or swimming up and down a river anymore. At the other end of it, we're about to move into one of my favorite times of year. And in fact, I was talking to Sean Leonard the other day and had just come back from the Amwell Magna. And as I explained to Sean, there's one bit of the river where there's 3 willow trees on a triangle on opposite banks. And it creates this wonderful bit of shade that has a gap between 2 of the trees where you can just about, if you get down and almost lie down in the bank, you can just about flick a line under there. And I was watching this trout constantly feeding on some little microscopic thing just underneath the surface. I spent an hour and a half emptying the contents of my fly box. It ignored every one of it. It treated me with the uttermost contempt, and I drove home with the biggest smile on my face that you could possibly ever imagine. Is there anything better anywhere in the world?
No, it's not just about the fish, is it?
No, not in the least.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and it is lovely to hear that your passion burns so brightly, and your love of fishing, and I'd like to reiterate again everything that you're doing, and I think for our listeners, look, this is the opportunity now that if you want to do something about something that means so much to so many of us, that we do have to do something about it and engage. And I hope this will, as I've said previously, inspire you to contact your MP, be vocal about what's actually going on out there. And perhaps we can use the model that Feargal and his team on the Amwell Magna and Fish Legal have actually got their river pretty much where they want it now. So if they can do it, there's other silos that we talked about of people out there can do the same sort of thing. So I hope this acts as the call to arms to people to say, right, okay, well, I like what Feargal says on Twitter, but why don't we do something about it? And I hope this inspires people to look at things a little bit more deeply and engage and do something about the damage that's being done to the environments that mean so much to us.
I once again would remind people we have spent 3 decades collaborating, working with, supporting, attending meetings, doing fish surveys, taking kick samples, reading borehole surveys. And 30 years later, out of all of that activity and all of that effort, these rivers are now in a worse condition than they ever were at any point in the last 30 years. It's failed. It's time to do something different.
Thank you for that, Feargal. It's been fantastic. We've talked for over an hour now, and there's so much more. I think we could talk a whole lot more, but I think really what we've got here is something for people to be inspired by. And this is one man's work. Just imagine if there were lots of us out there shouting in the same way, that people may listen that little bit more, and the water companies, the EA, and the wider general public, to see the damage that's being done. And like you said about the rivers, people swimming in them when it's not safe to do so. And if we can alert people to these things, that would be fantastic. So Feargal, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
I did warn you. Listen, the pleasure's been all mine. Anything I can do to help, please feel free to ask.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. If you have any questions, please look at, if you're on Twitter, look at what Feargal's doing on Twitter as well, and that will give you a good indication of what's happening out there. So I hope you can find him on there as well. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please fire them to me via the usual channels. But this has been the Fly Culture podcast. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.